If you're a real estate investor or property manager, it's not a question if you have to do an eviction, but when you have to do an eviction, especially if you are in the business for a long time. My name is Rosie Allen with the Property Coaches. Please follow me on this channel if you want more information about tenants, repairs, maintenance, and more. Eviction is the process of removing the tenant from your rental property, and this can happen in a lot of different scenarios. If the tenant is violating the lease, for example, if the tenant has unauthorized pets or occupants on the property, or the tenant is not keeping up with the cleanliness of the unit, as well as the most common type of eviction, which is for non-payment of rent. Keep in mind that you do not have to have a written legal lease in order to do an eviction. You can also have a verbal lease, but the key point is to ensure that both parties, both the tenant and the landlord, know the exact provisions of that lease. So what is the eviction process? Basically, it all starts with a violation of the lease. Let's take, for example, that the tenant is not paying rent. The very first thing you need to do is to post a 3-day notice to pay rent or surrender the premises. Once that notice expires and the tenant is not coming forth with the payment, then you move on to filing the eviction with the court. The eviction process is a legal process, it's a civil process that involves the court system. Once you file the eviction with the courts, they post or serve the tenant. In most states, if the tenant cannot be located, the process server will serve and post the notice on the tenant's door. Once the tenant has been served, the tenant will have a time period to respond to the lawsuit of the eviction. Usually it's about 5 days, but it varies from state to state and county sometimes. If the tenant does not answer the eviction, then the owner can file what is called a default with the courts, asking the judge to just sign the final eviction, and once the judge signs the final eviction, a writ of possession can be issued. The writ of possession is what tells the sheriff department or the police department that the owner is now entitled to the premises and they need to remove the tenant or any occupant from the property. If the tenant does respond to the eviction process, usually the court will set up a hearing date for the tenant and the landlord to come in to see what really is going on and make a determination on the case. If you're evicting a tenant for any violations of the lease besides payment of rent, it is really important that you take as much proof as possible. Let's say that the tenant has an unauthorized pet and the neighbor told you that they have an unauthorized pet. You need proof that that pet belongs to the tenant and is actually residing on the premises. You need to bring that proof to court. If you cannot get in an agreement with the tenant and the tenant continues to violate the lease, then you can file for eviction after the proper notices are posted. But it's very important as a landlord that you bring as much proof as possible because you need to show the judge that there is a violation and it's becoming an issue on the property. Once the writ is issued and the sheriff is notified, they will call you to make an appointment to come to the unit and take possession of the unit. If the tenant still remains in the unit, you need to make sure that you bring keys to the unit and a locksmith, because once they remove the tenant and the belongings, you need to rekey the property so that you take official possession of the unit. It's very important to keep in mind that the process of eviction is a legal process of removing the tenant from the property. It is not a process to get you more money for rent. It is not a process to have the tenant pay you for back rent or suing the tenant further. It is a process of taking back your rental property. Here are my top 5 tips to guide you on the eviction process. Tip number 1, make sure that the notice is properly prepared. If you're evicting for non-payment of rent, make sure the amount is correct, the dates are correct, tenant information is correct, and the address is properly placed. If you have questions on how to properly fill out these notices, I'm going to have a class coming up on these various notices that you need in order to evict a tenant. Tip number 2, if you're evicting the tenant for non-payment of rent, make sure that if you're going to take payment from the tenant during the eviction process, it's the full amount of, including the court fees, which in most states, you can pass on to the tenant. If you take a small portion of payment, then the eviction gets dismissed. So if the tenant comes up with a little bit of money and you take it without realizing it, you have to dismiss the eviction and start the whole process again, which means paying again to the courts for filing a new eviction. Tip number 3. If you're evicting the tenant for other issues regarding the lease, such as unauthorized pet, unauthorized occupants, or maybe they're not keeping up with the place, you need to bring enough evidence to prove your point. Videos, photos, date stamped conversations with the tenant, showing that you've tried to remediate the issue with the tenant and they are not complying with the lease. Tip number 4. Once the eviction has been finalized, try to get the tenant to move before the rent is issued or before the rent is done. It is not only painful for you as the landlord to wait a couple more weeks to get the tenant and get your property back, but imagine going to the property and have to remove the tenant's family, the kids, the pets, the couch, the beds, everything out to the curb. It is a very painful process for everybody involved. So as soon as the eviction for me is final, I try to really incentivize the tenant to move out before I go to the property with the sheriff's department. And tip number 5, and this is one of the most important tips, do not cut the utilities on the tenant because they're not paying rent. In most states, those could be huge lawsuits. Landlords say, I'm not going to pay for the water. I'm not going to fix the AC. I'm going to cut the power. And leaving the tenant without the utilities that you agreed upon during the lease could be a lot of losses to you and potentially dismissing the eviction. So maintain everything as you have, make sure the tenant has the utilities, and just move on with the eviction process. My name is Rosie Allen with the Property Coaches, and in this channel we teach property owners or property managers tips and tricks of the property management business. Follow us so that you can get more videos about tenants, repairs, maintenance, and more.